if you could provide a brief explanation on what the Stop ShotSpotter campaign is about?
So the Stop ShotSpotter campaign, it's a campaign that started in Chicago after the deployment of police officers following an alert by the system called ShotSpotter. It's allegedly a gunshot detection system. Deployed officers and resulted in the murder of a young boy in La Villita, a little village here in Chicago, named Adam Bonello. And so there were a number of, I would say, parallel and culminating forces around the time. A few of us had been researching and investigating how Chicago procures these contracts with tech groups to expand its surveillance apparatus. A number of us were looking at instances of police brutality, specifically on like the southwest and west sides of the city. And after this had happened, I think various organizers, activists, community groups, nonprofits, and so forth kind of came together and started having these larger discussions around what these surveillance apparatuses lead to, what the sort of consequences are of investing in technology that is primarily just placed in black and brown neighborhoods and has resulted in things like people getting stopped and frisked, or like with Adam's case, getting killed. And this campaign started here in the city. So once we had come together to start discussing these sorts of issues, and initially started by focusing on this one piece of technology called ShotSpotter, it started expanding outward. So there are now numerous ShotSpotter campaigns across the so-called U.S. In various localities that either already have a contract with the company that produces ShotSpotter, it's a company called Sound Thinking, or are considering having contracts with that company. And I would say that there are a number of goals associated with the campaign. The most clear one is in the cancellation of contracts, local contracts that Sound Thinking has. But I think there are also these larger, perhaps somewhat more abstract goals in the background, like having people reconsider their relationship to technology, having spaces where we can come together as various communities and talk about what we think safety is, without needing to involve some sort of state-based force like the police to tell us what it is in their opinion. And I think also just questioning this extremely quick amplification of surveillance dragnet across, again, the so-called U.S. And Chicago is, I think, a major site of struggle because we happen to be one of the most surveilled cities in the country. And while we focus on this one technology, ShotSpotter, I think the issue is far bigger than that. There are so many different kinds of technologies here, from license plate readers to red light cameras to GPS monitors and ankle bracelets. And so I think unfortunately the city gets used as a sort of pilot for these kinds of technologies, and they end up getting exported to other cities, or they get exported to other regions outside of the U.S. For military conflicts. And yeah, this is just one campaign of, I guess, are starting to grow around broader issues of surveillance.
So this means that it started around 2021, you'd say?
Yeah.
What sort of overseas partners do you find Chicago becoming a petri dish for?
It's become pretty obvious that Chicago has shared, specifically Chicago's police forces, have shared a lot of their techniques and technology sharing with Israel. A lot of surveillance apparatuses are designed by Israeli companies. A lot of tactics that are used on protesters or political dissidents here in the city are done through exchange programs, like with the Deadly Exchange that involves various police officers going to Israel and learning from IDF officers, in particular learning about Zionism and coming back with that kind of philosophy. Um, so I think that at least when it comes to these sorts of relationships with nation states, the U.S. and Israel have a really tight one. And that sort of relationship is very much built upon the sharing of military and police tactics. So the same sorts of techniques that are used to stifle any dissent from Palestinians are the ones that are applied by CPD against people here in the streets. Black and brown people every day, protesters during actions and so forth. And the technologies that are invested in and purchased inevitably also share some relationship there because they end up relying very heavily on developers from within that area. Now, ShotSpotter is an American company. This one might be a little bit different. But I will say that when it was started sometime in the 90s, ShotSpotter had selected various markets. And I should say I'm using SoundThinking and ShotSpotter as one thing. They changed their name. They used to be called ShotSpotter. They're called SoundThinking now. But this company had chosen military markets as one of its initial markets. So they had tried to sell these gunshot detection systems. They made like backpacks that soldiers could wear, and they would, I guess, automatically update other soldiers when gunfire was being detected in the vicinity of their backpacks. My understanding is that this market didn't really take off, and they don't seem to actually have any contracts with these military groups. But it just sort of goes to show you how these sorts of surveillance players look at multiple markets at one time. So it's like city police. It's also like military, and it's not just like U.S. military, but this larger military complex that involves multiple kinds of conflicts. And inevitably, when they can't sell to these sorts of contractors, they just end up contracting with smaller departments or local municipalities, cities, and so forth. And what they do after that is they have most of their tools, like hardware running their software, deployed in various regions across these smaller local municipalities. So, for example, Chicago has SoundThinking ShotSpotter system blanketed on primarily just the south and west sides of the city. It's blanketed only, at least as of what we know now, it was selected to only be placed in police beats that are majority Black, majority Latin American, indigenous, and they are not placed anywhere that has more than 50% white people in the population. And this is because they relied on just their historical crime data when choosing these locations. So the city would just say something like, well, this is what our crime data said. We have to put it in these places without any actual critical amount of thought as to why they had their crime data consistently just choose like black and brown areas. Yeah, so they place them in these locations They use them not just to deploy officers, but they use them to build these very comprehensive data sets. So they're constantly collecting sound data and region-based data within neighborhoods that are predominantly black and brown. And what they do is they repackage that data and sell it back to actors like data brokers. Data brokers are like private entities that aggregate a fuckload of data and then sell it back. So they'll either sell it back to other governments, like other city governments, so that they can use them in their products or use them to try to do some sort of like statistical analysis in the regions, or they'll sell it to federal governments, which we see a lot. This is generally how we see groups like ICE or the Department of Homeland Security get local level data that they use for deportations in cities that are in so-called sanctuary city ordinance regions, or they'll just use it to build sell to other private entities that use their data for other kinds of products that they're trying to build a profit off of. So I think an important thing to note there is that these tools have very direct and immediate carceral outcomes, right? Like they directly cause police officers to come to areas whenever the machines go off. And in Chicago, at least, ShotSpotter Alert has the highest priority. So it will deploy a police officer expecting gunfire immediately once the system goes off. But in the long term, what it's also doing is it's plundering data from the communities. And it's producing large amounts of profit off of these extremely painful, violent circumstances, and it's profit that the communities are never going to see. They're just going right back to companies like SoundThinking.
Okay. So this technology began in the war zone. That's really interesting to me. And then you're saying that it was regurgitated for more corporate bodies before it came back to the streets of Chicago.
These sorts of technologies start in a lot of small markets, and then the companies just kind of try reaching out for as many as they can. So I think my understanding is the way it began was it was a small pilot in Silicon Valley from a bunch of like Stanford alum who had made this product called ShotSpotter, and they were just testing it in a low-income community within Silicon Valley, not too far from Stanford itself. I think it was tested in East Palo Alto, which is predominantly Mexican and black. And when their testing and their piloting had given them enough sort of media attention, they started expanding to other markets. So they started trying to pivot into selling to these military forces in particular. It seemed like when that market wasn't taking off, they pivoted again to selling it to law enforcement. So they started trying to sell it to various kinds of police departments across the country, Chicago being one of their larger contracts. And then what you'll notice if you look at the sort of rhetoric that they maintain, either through their website or through the sorts of media interviews they give, is that they frequently change what the intended purpose of their tool is. So they might say, they have said, I will say, initially, that this was a tool made to, by their own sort of jargon, to reduce crime or to reduce gun violence. That got challenged a lot because you can't really have a tool that's reactionary, reacting to something like sound and assume that it's going to do anything to fix like the causes of violence. Violence is a social phenomena. It's not really something that's just like fixed by some sort of technology. And once that started getting questioned, they pivoted. So they ended up using a narrative that's really popular for them right now, where it's like, actually, we're using it for first responders so that they can get to a site where this machine's going off as fast as possible. And they'll likely pivot from this in the future because now there's more peer-reviewed research that's coming out and showing that the use of ShotSpotter actually reduces it lengthens the amount of time it takes for first responders to get to sites. So they just kind of keep changing the rhetoric around. I think at the end of the day, it's really just they're looking for markets as much as they can. Yeah, and I would say that they're a company, they're interested in profit. There's no true motivation for them to do what they say they're intending to do outside of just getting these large contracts that can produce profits and building these large data sets, which will create even larger returns in the future. So it's whatever they say should just be taken with a grain of salt.
How exactly does it? How does it work? Like, how is it? Is it like a sensor is placed and there's like a diaphragm connected to something, or because how one of my biggest questions after learning about it is like how does it discern between like a gunshot or a car backfiring or something else, or a house explosion? I don't know.
To answer the last part first, it doesn't do a very good job at discerning any of those things. I would say it has from what we've seen, it tends to confuse sounds pretty often. So you can set off ShotSpotter with non-gunshot sounds. There have been, I think, there have been examples of it being set off in court documents that show it's been set off by like a car backfiring or by fireworks, right? So like, you might just have some kids like playing with fireworks, and then all of a sudden one of these devices goes off, and then the cops come in. And these are huge problems. But I'll get into that a little bit later. I think when it comes to how the technology functions at all, is that the city has microphones on a large amount of telephone poles, light poles on the corners of streets. Again, primarily in the west and southern police beats here in Chicago. And what they're doing is that they are set up in a way so that they work with SoundThinking ShotSpotter software. And if the software, which is using what we call an automated decision system or a machine learning system, it is constantly passively listening. So it's always listening. It's waiting to be set off by a sound that fits some idea of what the machine learning system thinks is a gunshot. The way they do that is they train the models off of these sorts of like data sets that they've already amassed and use that to try to teach the system like this is what a gunshot sounds like. And that's using a process that might be outside of the scope of our discussion, but it's usually using something called a convolutional neural network. It's a kind of machine learning technique that you use to normally determine whether the pattern of something like a sound wave is matching the pattern of what you want it to match, in this case a gunshot. And these sorts of tools, they can occasionally work well in like laboratory settings, but sound's a very confusing thing. And when you have these tools deployed on like, on street poles, when they're outside and there's a lot of noise in the background and like sounds can reflect off of walls, and we're in a city, like there's so many things to control, it doesn't really matter. I think there's the sort of conditions make it likely that these sensors will be setting off in opportune moments. And I think, if you ask me, I think SoundThinking is aware of that, because when they've been pressed for sharing information related to things like their not just accuracy rates, but like their what we call um, their false alarm rates and like their different sorts of rates that can tell you whether something is like a true negative or a true positive, things like that. There's been a lot of pushback. They don't really make that data public, and I think if you're as skeptical as I am, it's probably because it looks really bad. These systems probably, yeah, they probably fucking go off all the time, and they're like, well, we don't want our customers to know that. But I think like one thing I want to say too is that even if it was some sort of a perfect world for their systems and they were always accurately determining where a gunshot was being fired, that doesn't change anything. Like, the fact of the matter is, you still have these devices only in certain neighborhoods. The result of these devices is that police officers come into a region, assuming that anyone walking through the region, within the region, like just near the region could be firing a gun and priming the officers to act in that way. It's producing conditions where violence is most likely, and it's doing it only in neighborhoods that are black and brown.
What you sound like you're describing is like they automated broken windows policing.
That's exactly it. Yeah, yeah. And we're seeing these kinds of you know, like um, like we're seeing stop and frisk basically get digitized. Like we're seeing people consistently in these neighborhoods getting stopped and fucked with by cops because the cops are like, oh well, the sensor went up, so it's gonna justify me doing whatever I want to you.
Oh, yeah. I got two questions, I believe now. So, I know that this is you've said that I don't know if they were pressed with a FOIA in order to talk about this information, but is there a certain decibel threshold to these sensors?
There should be. I'm not sure if I have that information on me at the moment. I can look it up and try to get back to you. Yeah, yeah.
And lastly, like this seems like it's a very complex system in which somebody, like you said, made a neural network in order to hear shots. And I imagine that the amount of time that they put into this, they could tell what grain of 9mm was used, what grain of this, what grain of that. Has there ever been a point or a case in time where ShotSpotter was used to prove someone's guilt?
So there have been attempts. There have been attempts to use ShotSpotter records as a way to claim that a person is guilty of firing off a gun. But what we've seen in Chicago is that the vast majority of ShotSpotter evidence that's turned into court is thrown out by prosecutors. So while they might have these sorts of claims that their devices are doing, I don't know, X, Y, and Z, being very accurate about what's being fired and when. It's not really it's not really accurate enough for anyone to be like, well, this is useful. It's mostly just like putting people in the conditions where they're going to be harassed by cops, put in jail for an indeterminate amount of time because there have been people who have been jailed for a long time following ShotSpotter alerts. Like Michael Williams of the Associated Press did a big piece on. He's an older black man in his 70s who was put in Cook County Jail for 11 months. Following an alert, only for prosecutors to throw out the evidence because they're like, actually, it sucks. This is trash. It doesn't say anything. Sorry, you're back out.
That's terrible. That man he'll never get his life back or his 11 months back, I mean.
It's just time stolen. And so in one sense, it's like no, it's not actually showing any sort of evidence for these kinds of things happening. That it just makes it so that there are regions that end up getting targeted, and the people that happen to be within the regions get harassed. I would say, if anything, these kinds of tools, not just ShotSpotter, but really any kind of region-based surveillance apparatus, by which I mean any kind of surveillance tool that deploys officers to certain locations or regions, it's really just instantiating a border where people can end up getting harassed because of their vicinity to the tool. So I think what we end up seeing as a result is like these are tools that just justify further harassment. Um, they, surveillance is nothing new. I think those of us who like grew up poor or grew up black and brown or just like within communities that are harassed here within this context by police and state violence are already aware that any kind of excuse will be used to harass our people. And this is just the modern version of it, I would say. And I think it ends up benefiting off of this misplaced optimism that anything made with technology is objective, which isn't true. And that there is some sort of uh, justification to harass people just because some sort of a computer device said so.
Can you imagine them trying to like connect it to drones or those stupid little robot dogs that people are trying to strap guns on?
I think one of the scary things about it is how like a lot of us have just gotten used to it and don't even know it exists.
There's something about 4C, I think, that really speaks to that. It's just kind of like, what is it here? Like the state doesn't need a pressure for censorship, and this sort of case it doesn't have the pressure for surveillance. It's just like we're just used to it. It's just an unfortunate new kind of normal, right? Where it's like you just assume you're gonna have to give up some sort of data, or you just assume that you're gonna have some intrusion into privacy. Um, and like there haven't been. Maybe it's because we haven't had enough like concrete wins that have restored our sense of privacy in the face of state intervention. I don't know. Maybe it just feels so daunting because these technologies are so abstract. I'm not really sure, but there's definitely a sense of like I don't know if I want to call it apathy even, but just like this is it. Like we just have to expect that there's going to be some sort of weird like digital tool that's always harassing us.
Right. Like I know that I don't know how many of my neighbors in Little Village are aware of ShotSpotter. What's the other name now?
They call themselves sound thinking now.
Of sound thinking being present in the neighborhood. I know that we had this a few of my neighbors and I we were having dinner together at some restaurant, and there was someone called a neighbor called one of my neighbors and said, "Hey, we heard some gunshots or what sounded like gunshots." And honestly, it's very hard to know in Little Village because people are always popping fireworks year round. This I feel like this started like 6 years ago. People just start popping fireworks year round. It's really annoying. Um, and right away though, my like our dinner got disrupted because we started calling different parents. Well, then my neighbors started calling different parents and telling them make sure your kids are inside because you know what happens. There's like a supposed gunshot. Then the cops just grab whoever's nearby outside and accuse them of shooting somebody or whatever. Um, Now, after hearing this conversation, now I gotta myself stay inside more when I hear these different things that could be mistaken for a gunshot. Um, as I think I also got to tell my neighbors too, like, hey, these are the other things that can be mistaken for gunshots, and I know that the response time is real. Like if they think that there's something, that response time is real. I know people have confirmed it. They show up pretty fast. Um, yeah, that's another thing to adapt to.
For sure. And I think, Chris, one thing you had said about how, like you have some of these situations where maybe, like, you and your neighbors hear something and you inform each other. Like, I think this sort of a tendency we're also seeing that get like more obscure but also amplified because systems like ShotSpotter are already integrated with other kinds of carceral tools like Citizen app, for example. It's an app that is mostly used. It's kind of like a map, and it shows like alleged crime in your area based on like people reporting it to the app. And it's already integrated with things like ShotSpotter, so it'll give you alerts for ShotSpotter on the app. And what you'll probably see is like a bunch of people in the community or nearby are going to be looking at this app, and it's ShotSpotter isn't just feeding information to cops who'll come in and harass people, but it's going to keep criminalizing neighborhoods in the eyes of the people who already live there, right? Like you're going to get into these situations where you're reinforcing the sorts of anxieties within your community, which are frequently racialized. And I think what you'll end up seeing is that, like, these tools aren't just following bad, historically racist police data, but they're creating it because they're in those same neighborhoods, so they're continuously repeating the same thing. I think one thing we need to know and understand is that when you have these kinds of automated tools, they're not actually, there's this mistake that they could be positioned in some sort of like fashion where they'll lead us into some sort of better future. But the reality is they kind of just freeze time. You end up placing them there, and it ensures that whatever kind of inequities they're powered by are going to just keep being present in the future. So you have these tools like ShotSpotter, right? They're placed in neighborhoods that police data already says are criminal a priori. They already assume people are criminal. And it just keeps producing more data saying, yes, there's a crime here. Yes, there's a crime here. Yes, there's a crime here. And that has long-term effects, right? It just makes it so that these sorts of communities are consistently being harmed by police and by states because they now have this new administrative justification. They're saying like, wow, our data said this was bad before, and it's saying this area is even worse now, and we're going to use that to keep justifying further uses of force.
Okay, so they can say, you don't need more funding now because of this many reports from our ShotSpotter division or whatever nonsense,
Yeah, I think those are the sorts of dangers that we can see further down the line, and that's not just something you can fix by like claiming some sort of nonsense like we can make the system less biased. It's not about the system; it's about these tools existing to begin with. They're used to criminalize. They're always going to be biased. It's not going to be fixed by putting ShotSpotters in every neighborhood in the city because, like, police already treat every neighborhood differently. It doesn't really matter. They'll likely just respond differently. It's just a smokescreen, really. It's an illusion. It's another way to throw money into some sort of a system that justifies arrests, violence, death, and so forth.
Is you mentioned that it's linked to Citizen. Is it linked to other things like Nextdoor or Ring or the Five Eyes? I don't know.
Yeah, I'll have to get back to you on that. I think it is, but I do not recall. I just know that these sorts of systems tend to integrate with each other. And so here's one thing I'll say actually is that Sound Thinking, the company that makes ShotSpotter, they recently purchased a technology that was a favorite tool for ICE and Department of Homeland Security called CopLink X, or it used to be called CopLink X. They call it Crime Tracer now. CopLink X, or Crime Tracer, is a database that takes in a large amount of police data, things like ShotSpotter alerts, for example, but also any other kind of police interaction from various municipal departments. And what they do with it is they sell it to other police departments across the country. So, for example, Chicago just entered a 6-month pilot for Crime Tracer with Sound Thinking. We just, I think, found out about this right in the beginning of December, I think on December 4th. They did this again without any sort of public inquiry. No one knew that the city was going to enter a 6-month pilot, but they did it anyways. And Crime Tracer, or what it used to be called CopLink X, because it amasses so much data and it gets sold to multiple partners, what this does is it facilitates data sharing among different kinds of police departments and federal agents. And so when it was CopLink X, for example, ICE would use it to get just as one of its ways to get data from regions that are, again, in so-called sanctuary ordinance cities, and then use that to do things like justify deportation further down the line, especially when cops were unable to use their own criminal courts to prosecute people who are migrants in different regions. So, groups like Sound Thinking, they're producing these data sets and making them bigger because they sell the contracts to other departments who then give them the data, and then everyone has access to this like ginormous data set. And then they can start using that for various kinds of operations at both the federal and local level, without warrants, because all police have to do is buy it. All cities have to do is buy it. All federal agencies have to do is buy it. And it's not to say like a warrant makes it good, right? But it does mean that it's just another layer that they can skip and try to use it to start arresting and harassing people. And I think that's sort of what the end goal for a lot of these tools are. Is create data sets that are as big as possible, and then just use them to sell to any party that wants to do whatever they want to it. There's no real regulation. There's no real stopgaps into sharing data in this way. If someone like Citizen wanted to buy, Crime Tracer and then start integrating that data set into its own tools, I'm sure that's something that can be done within the private sector. But yeah, these tools are the companies and they're sort of hardware and software to some extent, right? It's decentralized. They're not really necessarily interacting with each other, but at the end of the day, all of these sort of criminal tools end up networked and causing larger issues for Black and Brown communities in this era that's post-digital. Makes it much easier to harass people, makes it much easier to track people. Yeah, and it makes local protections much harder to actually create.
I think one important thing that I heard is, even though this technology, this oppressive technology, is creating new ways to frame people, put innocent people behind bars. You said that there have been situations where cases have been, or they've been able to throw out ShotSpotter or something as proof for trying to convict somebody. So I think that's for my neighbors, anybody who lives around ShotSpotter. Just remember that. Tell your friends that if they're using that evidence against you, don't let that intimidate you. Don't let them fool you into thinking that that's all that it takes to put you behind bars. Um, don't strike a deal with them based on the assumption that they're going to get you on that.
Basically, every case in the last year or two in Chicago using that evidence has just been thrown out. So
It's good to know. There's some silver lining. I think this conversation gave me heartburn. I don't know if it's the way I'm feeling. It's I need some Tums.
Yeah, once you crack into that, you might set off a shot fire, so be careful.
One of the reasons why I think we started talking about doing this interview was because somebody was giving me an update about the Shot Spotter campaign to stop it, and they were concerned about what the new mayoral administration was going to mean for the campaign. They talked about the fear of state capture of the campaign because it seemed like at that time that some folks who were part of the Stop Shot Spotter campaign were going to be joining the new mayoral administration of Chicago. But before we get into that, and you can address anything I've said up to now, I would like to just spend a little bit of time just kind of like talking about the idea of what state capture is.
This sort of discourse is definitely really present among the campaign. I think it still is. And I think it's safe to say that it's not unique to this campaign, but it's really just this larger thing that we've been seeing across Chicago, organizing and movement spaces ever since the Johnson administration started. A large number of organizers and activists had taken on city roles. I think there was also, right, like a lot of optimism moving into the administration because of how many promises were made to campaign organizers and movement makers and shakers. So I think one big part of this is that, at least specific to our campaign, is that the Johnson administration had more or less positioned itself as being a mayoral administration which would cause the cancellation of the contract, the local Chicago contract with John Spotter. This obviously has not happened. In fact, during the most recent budget reveal, it was seen that the contract had been retained, or at least the amount spent in the previous years had been retained for 2024. And there's been a lot of vagueness around whether or not it's going to be canceled. I think it can be canceled. I believe it's in February when it can be up for cancellation. So there's that. I think it doesn't bode well that we have these sorts of this amount of money already earmarked in advance. It isn't great that we're also seeing like another pilot entered into, apart from the ShotSpotter technology, but another product that this company is selling. That isn't great. And I think when it comes to campaigns and movement spaces in particular, there's this worry that individuals who are now, at least now have some newfound proximity to power and are still sort of involved in their campaigns, while at the same time being involved in this administration, produce a situation where there's a large sort of conflict of interest, right? So it could be, I think there are some questions around that many of us are, myself included, many of us are asking around how do we interact with people who we consider comrades in the past when they have these sort of government positions. Is that something that we can do? Is that something that we shouldn't do? I personally tend to be of the mindset that it's a bad idea. So that's already my sort of bias. I think it's not the smartest idea to have folks that are within the halls of government also that deeply invested into our campaigns. And there's a number of reasons for this. I think some of them are related to operational security. I think it's a mistake to have folks that can be a potential vulnerability for leaking information to our opposition. And I think it should be made clear that when it comes to many of these movements, the opposition is always the city, regardless of who's in the seat of power. And I think it's also just a I think for me, I would argue that a lot of this sort of gets kind of muddied and sort of like tied together with this idea that an electoral strategy is all that's necessary to create some sort of substantial or sufficient change at the level of community. And I don't think that's a good idea. I think across history we've seen that this has resulted in usually power being just recentered into some other body, some other institutions that suddenly come together. We tend to see like a lot of so-called progressive groups or groups on the left institutionalize, professionalize, and exhibit these vanguardist tendencies where they end up kind of being framed as a new elite. I think that should be quite clear, at least with the current administration and the way it's framed itself as progressive, partly because it was able to hire all of these movement and so forth, right? So it ends up sort of positioning itself as kind of like a moral torchbearer in the same way that I think nonprofits generally get sort of framed in that way in opposition to like this kind of much more organic community organizing that happens across communities that are facing some heightened levels of oppression. I think in general, it's just it's a real concern. I think we need to, as people who are interested in these kinds of issues like carceral violence or state violence or carcerality in general, technology, movement stuff. You don't even have to consider yourself a leftist. I think if you're just interested in these kinds of politics, like we need to have a better sense of questioning who our allies in opposition are and what it sort of means to maintain these relationships in a way where you're just not creating conflicts of interest or recentering power to some other group that isn't actually going to give it up or redistribute it in any way that's meaningful. And I know, Chris, we've talked about some of this stuff, just kind of vanguardism, especially on the left, a bit.
One term that I've seen that was used like for sure, like in the early 1900s, that I feel like it's fallen out of usage is the term careerist.
It's coming back.
Honestly, it was like just me and one other person because we would talk about the DSA in Chicago, and I was like, I don't want to hang out with these people. They're a bunch of careerists. That's what it is. And we would kind of like pick apart, well, what's this person's job, and where are they from, and what are they trying to do? Because it doesn't seem like the way that I've seen them relating to the people of the neighborhood they're in or whatever working in, it's careerism, and 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 it. I feel like anytime I use the word though with people, it feels anachronistic or like people don't quite understand what I'm talking about. But I think it's something that we have to. I think it should be part of the language more, so we can identify kind of like do's and don'ts. And I think it's quite possible that a lot of the people that we should have learned from, when starting groups, um, a lot of those people have been jailed, they've been killed, so there's a lot of information that a lot of groups should have had access to, but they couldn't because they're like people they would have learned from. Well, they've been punished and disappeared. But I'm hoping that this interview helps us to kind of learn and adapt and have better practices for like how we're linking up with people to do campaigns or this or that action.
I think one thing we need to like come to grips with is that is unfortunately a sort of moral aesthetic that people adopt when it comes to doing any sort of like action, political action, within the domain of whatever we want to consider the left, or like for some people, I don't know, just left of center. And the unfortunate part of that, right, is that we end up focusing so much on the aesthetic, we end up losing the or a much more nuanced understanding of what a relationality is, like what it means to have some sort of an ego death when we do this work, what it means to like, you know, like, are you willing to do this work if like you don't have any recognition for it? Because a lot of us don't. And Chris, to your point, unfortunately, a lot of our ancestors who have really gotten us this far have been disappeared as a result of it. I think that sort of a draw of careerism is such a real thing because the structures we have, they co-opt our language, they co-opt our sort of, I think, desires, and they use them in a way where, you know, you can build a whole career off looking like you're on the left. You build a whole career off of being like visible on the left. But like when you start doing that, or when we have groups of people who start doing that, and there's no true redistribution of power, by which I mean to say, are the communities that lacked autonomy before now in a position where they have autonomy? And are those that wielded power over them now in a position where previous power is negated? I don't think those things are questioned enough. I think it ends up being like more often the case where it's like, maybe if I have a career, I can help people in the future because I don't know, you know, this might be me overreaching, but it's because like we might feel special enough to do that, or we might feel like we've got some sort of moral knowledge that other people don't have. And it's really not the case. I think all of us are just inherently built to have these conversations among each other and make decisions collectively. But careerism is like it's a hyper individualism, right? Like you're building a career and you're using this sort of facade of doing it for a community, but it's really just to sort of position yourself in a state where you can make decisions on behalf of the community.
I have a definition in my mind of careerism. Maybe this is incorrect, but it's for people who think that they can get a retirement plan and a revolution and at the same time, when it should be the revolution is your retirement plan, right? Like you've strengthened the communities.
Hell yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's a fucking great way of putting it.
And honestly, I think the kind of our failures, unwillingness to learn, or inability, or just not learning from our failures, I could see how some people were like, revolution ain't gonna give me that retirement situation. And so like we got to make sure we get that covered, and get more competent at helping others, helping ourselves, meeting our needs.
That's going to be really hard in the time of greenwashing. You know, we're like, we did it. We put a rooftop garden. Now we got
I think Murray Bookchin has this one speech where it's called like intelligentsia and the new intellectuals or something like that. And Bookchin, he makes this. I think one thing he says, and I think this is from like the 70s or 80s, where he was saying that a big change that he saw in his lifetime was that a lot of people who wanted to change the world, um, the idea they had it like backwards from what he saw earlier in his life. And I think he said that like there's this new thing developing where people are saying like, my goal is to get a career first, and then I'll change the world. Whereas and so that the priority is more about like money, prestige, economic, the self, hyper, too much of the self. And Bookchin said that, you know, in the past, like a lot of revolutionaries, it wasn't like that. It was, my career is to change the world. It's not to get that job. It's just to change the world, and everything else. like has to is will be subordinated to that, which is kind of like a weird way to phrase it. But I would say it has to be like in harmony with it.
We're like in a position where so many of us are thrust into precarity so often it ends up, I think, unfortunately, understandably, being like of interest to people that just try to see some level of stability and then think of redefining our social relationships as an afterthought. But you can't do that. You just can't do that. I think like by moving in that direction, you've already undercut the opportunity to change the social relationship.
Yeah, and I haven't looked into this in a while, but we're like in a scarier and scarier time. I think like 10 years ago, maybe longer. I remember the government was like the largest employer in the country, and I don't know if is that the future? Everybody's going to become government workers, and so I part of me understands the pressure some people feel because like, and I see the same thing in the co-op world where right now I think there's a counterinsurgency going on in the solidarity economy where the government's noticing, hey, people are trying to start creating their own autonomous economics. Let's reel them back in with these grants. Um, uh, and so it's people who have criticized governmental power in the past 200 years. I don't think they would have imagined like how nuts it would get like where we are today. And I think a lot of us we don't even understand still like the monstrosity of it. Um, but then there's also I think some folks they mean well. They don't understand. They don't really understand how evil the government is and how quick you can go from being someone who means well, who's not in a position of power, turning these levers that grind people, versus someone who all they do is now they're just like part of the machinery and they're pulling the levers and now they're part of it. But there's that saying that I think is really great. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. So a lot of these people who want to like join government or whatever, I'd say really bear that in mind, because a lot of people who've done so much harm, I think a lot of them meant well, and a lot of people's idea of love is really messed up, really, really messed up, and they hurt a lot of people in the name of love, and I think that extends to empowerment, revolution, all these other things. One one thing that I feel like we need to get really good at though is clamping in like in groups and moving spaces, having agreements to help really clamp down on the careerism. Um, there's one group I'm in where like we're setting up these rules. We're like, are you a landlord? Are you a manager? Have you ever have you been part of any armed forces? Um, and I think one of our rules too is well we haven't we've been practicing it. We haven't quite like formalized it, which is if you're aspiring to any kind of like position of power, including just like any government position, you have to let us know, and we're gonna investigate that. Because I think there are probably some governmental positions that are not that bad. Um,
Water, sanitation.
Garbage worker, yeah, yeah. Though, of course, the way you're doing it can be bad. But yeah, these are things I think we need to get more serious about, and get weird about because it's definitely like going against the grain to be thinking this deeply and creating these types of agreements. Um, and at this moment, I'm grateful for all the people I know who are broke, who have been doing such like have been trying their hardest for so many years to do good, and they could easily make a lot of money by crossing over to the other side, by even being an informant or something. Um, but a lot of people I know are like struggling, and I don't think they'd be struggling if they, joined the enemy. So it's also a moment of gratitude for everyone who's broken, struggling, who have retained their integrity and have like been good role models in that sense.
So it's like is the grand scheme here is like we got this, we have the AI, now we have the quantum computer to be able to sift through it like nothing.
Like, I don't know. Like the end goal for this sort of
Like
thing?
if you have terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of data, you can make the best AI, and I don't know how fast it'll take. I'm not an IT person. But then you have a quantum computer, right? And that's supposed to change the game. Everything's fast. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, you could do everything in parallel. I don't think we should be using any of these tools. I think it's a bad precedent that's being set because it's just setting stage for, almost like irreversible mass surveillance at a level we've never seen before.
It's like Minority Report.
Yeah, basically, dude, it's just like all this future crime bullshit. Like, I mean, that's what predictive policing is, you know? It's just that.
Yeah, one thing I suspect that they're gonna do with all the data is they're gonna use it to help. If they keep us around, I think they're gonna use it to help cold people more by looking at all this past data to like if the premises are like what explicit or implicit in what I'm saying, if they're real, I'm thinking maybe they're gonna do something like how like the Bolsheviks, how their regime, they would tell people, hey, your past relatives were like royalists, therefore, you their descendant, you're guilty, you're a bad person. And so something I suspect that they're gathering all this data and they'll be able to like build up ways like in the future to get rid of people.
Yeah, I think that's the reality of administrative violence. Like almost every regime has used it, right? Like they've used their data sets and just in computational ones, but like ledgers of families, right? Like I don't know, people's names and last names, like what sort of things they have written in their visa, etc. It doesn't matter. It's just like these are more tools that they can use to create whatever narrative they want to incarcerate. Like it's not. It doesn't. How do I say it? If they want to like make up something to get you for, they'll fucking do it because they'll have so much access to your life.
Yeah. And it might not even be based on anything, just another thing to lean on and say, well, it's based on something, 'cause that's a lot of their science is totally, I don't think yeah, they don't believe in it. They're just like, it's just a distractive excuse.
You know, the funny thing too is like if you go around, something we've seen, like folks who went around canvassing for a ShotSpotter campaign pretty early on. Um, every now and then they'd end up like talking to a cop, like at a gas station or something. I don't know. And when they talked to them about ShotSpotter, none of them would go on the record, but every one of them is like, "Yeah, it doesn't work." So like they know, like they're aware, like a beat cop is fucking aware that shit doesn't work, and like, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Like it's just part of their job or whatever. Yeah, and like another thing we didn't really talk about, but like maybe worth thinking about or looking into in the future is that like beyond the Johnson administration, like right now our current police superintendent Larry Snelling was the former chief of the Bureau of Counterterrorism, right? And those like counterterrorism folks are obsessed with surveillance apparatuses and data sets because that's how people end up getting like thrown in jail or getting RICO charges or like getting like considered a terrorist. It's like you see this aspect of securitization, which is a term that like a lot of the international relations people use to describe this creep of how a state just generates threats. Like it creates threats out of whatever it deems is, it creates security threats out of whatever it deems an existential threat. And so when we end up having this much data available, it won't be that hard for some sort of a actor at some point in the future to say, like, yeah, we're just gonna now say that everyone who was caught, like, moving on this highway on this date is a terrorist. And wow, we have the data for that. Like, wow, we're gonna throw them all in jail. I think it makes it sets a lot of bad precedents. I think, like, one thing that I've heard from a lot of abortion activists that they've been worried about is how these sorts of tools, not just ShotSpotter, but other ones, like license plate readers that blanket all the highways in and out of Illinois, they retain enough information so that you can start basically creating, like, these simulations or models of where people have been moving, because so much of their license plate data has been collected at so many different points. And you can feasibly see that people might be getting, like, medication or perhaps abortions in, like, areas outside of their locality and region, and they'll just get dinged for it later in the future because that data is collected and shows that they ended up, like, moving in ways that the local and federal governments didn't want them to move. So just our ability, I think, to take up space, to take very literal physical space in this world is restricted under these kinds of conditions, because it means that, if at any point in time anything you've ever done can be considered, like, bad by some sort of force and power, then it can be used against you. And, like, that's kind of new. We haven't had that kind of individual level history archived so deeply as we have now, because the apparatus is just so much more complex and bigger.
Going back to the careerism, and I probably have a few other things to talk about still in regards to the state capture, or the topic of state capture. There was this one. I was reading the minutes of this one Congress of the Spanish National Confederation of Labor, and there's this one question that was raised at this one Congress, where they go, essentially, if there's a what do we do if there's a political element in the union? So these are workers' unions in Spain, and this is like early 1900s, and that union was always getting tempted to join with the government in some way, some, like, kind of like government collaboration. And there's this interesting response. I think somebody gave this opinion. I don't know how many people were on board with it, but they said, essentially, if there's a political organism or, like, pathogen in the union, you need to like isolate it and cut it out.
That, that's some loaded language. A pathogen.
Like, they use some pretty strong words.
Excise the disease.
Or might have happened at some point. Were there any kind of signs that you noticed at the time, or that in retrospect you notice now that, like, hey, these people are gonna maybe go over and join the government?
Yeah, I mean, there were definitely signs. I think it was just, I think there was a transition in strategy towards being much more electorally focused. And I think when that starts happening in campaigns, it's probably when this conversation this broader conversation around careerism or, like, political relationality should be coming into play, if not earlier. Because by engaging within the electoral environment, I think you're just necessarily creating a position where certain sorts of government jobs become viable to members of campaigns. And certain people who are already in government jobs may already start being involved in the campaign. So the kind of, like, division between, like, government and, like, some sort of, like, non-governmental organizing, it gets muddied and it gets much less clear. And I think that, perhaps in this campaign, definitely in other sorts of spaces I've been in the past, I feel like that's kind of been the tendency I've seen, is that there's a pull towards doing an electoral approach towards changing policies or seeing the ends of certain kinds of investments in the budget, that kind of cracks open the door. And it sort of does so in a way where it's like, if you want to see this issue change and you want to do it electorally, you can also do it by taking a government job, because that's like the next step. I think it's really to sort of make it maybe more clear. It's these are conversations that need to happen alongside the development of strategy and tactics, and you can start potentially seeing a trend towards conditions that invite careerism when these more electoral elements start coming into play, is my assumption in this case, at least based off what I've seen and what I've read about other sorts of like organizing that's happened historically in Chicago, from like Haymarket to now.
I like how there's some organizing meetings, like do a protest or a demo or disruption, and it gets to that point where there's someone who's like, oh, and by the way, we're not going to have this conversation about pulling permits. We're not going to pull a fucking permit. It'll be cool when people start saying, like, organizing. By the way, nobody's gonna run for government. Nobody's gonna join. Don't fucking talk about it. We're not gonna be part of your resume. You can't use this on your resume.
Bro, yeah. Or governor or something.
Yeah, in Little Village, me and my neighbors, they know how to win an aldermanic election. You know, and they could, and they've talked it over multiple times. And I've been the asshole to say, like, you're not gonna change shit. Like, you're gonna become the very thing that you hate. And we haven't had a chance to work it through. And I'm grateful to another neighbor of mine who, like, I think it was like the third time where I was like the lone asshole saying this. You know, because these people, they mean really well. They mean really well. Um, but finally, it was like one of my neighbors. She also spoke up, and she was saying, like, "Nah, man, there's something bigger that needs to change. Like, in like the spirit of the people here, and how we relate to each other. It's like just replacing, the alder person with one of us ain't gonna do it." Um, and yeah, I'm of that position too, man. There's so much change that needs to happen in Chicago, and it's there's no shortcut, and it's not going to come from above. I don't see it happening. And I think that kind of those ideas, they escape the imagination, and I think that makes sense because a lot of people, we've been inducted into certain ideas of how, like, first of all, a lot of people, we don't have a lot of us don't really have our own ideas that we trust of, like, what makes people sick, what makes people oppressed, and what makes them better. We're not a healing centric society, or the healing centric societies aren't really around. Um, but so what do you think about, like, where the anti shot spotter campaign is at now? Like, should people um, should people support the current campaign that's existed since prior to um, the the new mayor administration?
I think if anything, I don't see any issue in supporting the current campaign. I just think that we need to be thinking bigger than just ShotSpotter. I think the the campaign that exists within the city right now, I think, is moving towards a direction where there is more pressure on the current administration as the time to remove the contract, or sorry, as the time that the contract is up for, I believe, renewal, ticks down. So I think it's like 60 days from when we're recording. And like that's useful. I think there's like something useful to supporting a motion that would remove the amount of investment the city is putting into this kind of technology. But I think we need to be real and know like that's not going to be enough. Like even if this succeeds and like they stop funding this one company, if there's not like a sufficient amount of creative imagination that puts us in a place where we're entirely cutting off the flow of data from the public sector to the private sector. We're putting like real ass stopgaps in another company coming in and selling a product because like these campaigns don't exist in a vacuum, and I think that some of the wins that the current campaign has had when it comes to things like showing how not great this technology is have been used by other oppositional forces. There are other surveillance groups that are like, yeah, the campaign's right, but you know what does work? Our product. Like that's stuff that benefits other actors that are in the same market. And so I think like that there is some sort of lower level, I think, benefit towards supporting this campaign's goals in removing the contract Chicago has with ShotSpotter. But I just don't think that that's going to create some sort of lasting change. I think that is a much bigger question around how we, one, think about keeping each other safe and interact with each other without using these sort of state tools like police. But two, also just like create this sort of pressure to prevent the establishment of new digital systems that are just going to take the place of the old ones. And that, I think, you're not going to do that just electorally. I think you're going to. I think if, like the 60 days are up and nothing's changed, then that's when you escalate. And if that doesn't work, then escalate again. So I think, I personally, I think it's fine to keep supporting the current iteration of the campaign, but I think we need to be thinking bigger. I think we need a much larger, cohesive resistance against surveillance in general in this city, and the transfer of data and the way that it's transferred.
Yeah, when you talk about it, man, it's like all that data stuff. It's the data surveillance. It's like its own hydra within a bigger hydra.
Yeah, and it's like a corporate state nexus, right? Like it's not just government; it's all these corporate actors that want all these grants, all of these sorts of funding from like federal governments, other states, other nation states, militaries, and so forth. And like getting rid of one technology is not going to change that. I'm afraid it's just not. This is there's a phrase that gets used a lot in like the tech space. It's like data is the new oil. It's a phrase I've heard. Which like has its flaws. It's not a great phrase either. But I think what's useful there is that there's like a colonial aspect to getting data. It's you take territory, you take it through digital tools, and you use that to start plundering data that's reintegrated into these other systems, and then used to just produce these tools that'll continuously harm the communities that the data's being taken from to begin with. And like just in that way, again, you can stop one company from doing that, but like that's a huge fucking market, and really this market should just be completely destroyed. Or it'll just keep incentivizing more and more like technocrats from stepping in to constantly try to take this data and more aldermen who want to like make it seem like they've done something for their community, so they just like buy a contract with a tool that doesn't work. Like, it's a whole fucking mess. And like you said, Chris, it's a way bigger hydra than just one technology, or even like 20 technologies. It's just a huge issue.
Yeah, I don't know how to think about it honestly though. Is it like how are we gonna free ourselves from this? Is it are we focusing on symptoms and not getting to like the root cause? I don't know, and I don't really meet too many people who are trying to have those conversations because and I guess I'm very wanting of those conversations because I get tired of addressing symptoms.
Yeah, you want results, right? Um, when I think in that vein, I always end up going into fiction. Like I always end up like just throughout this conversation, the first thing I think about is Mr. Robot and like how much is covered in like the surveillance state and what it's capable of, how it's exploited. I I often feel like I know the tools are out there. They're just not within anyone's hands. I trust, to like disrupt in a useful way.
Well, I like what we've gotten to though about like trying to think bigger, and I'm glad that you took the initiative to talk about how like what we need to do is probably more complex than what the campaign.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I think, again, this might be outside of the scope of this conversation, but like, we need to take internationalism way more seriously for this sort of organizing, right? Like, when we were talking just a little bit earlier about how these technologies develop, it's like they're not they don't develop within the like confines of a city or a nation state. Like they're usually military tools across multiple nation states and like proxy nations, and like they end up piloted in various places to like either take territory very literally, take oil very literally, or like incarcerate people. Um, and like the the U.S. is just one factor in that, but it's like way fucking bigger. Like I think a lot of these tools are used for borders, for instantiating them, for enforcing them across Latin America. Like a lot of these tools are used for like just like harassing Palestinians, and they have been for a long time. Like so, there's a lot we have to do at the local level, but I think at the end of the day, the development of a surveillance state isn't just confined in any one nation state. It's like it's part of this larger nexus of power that ends up involving many corporate forces and many state forces all at once. Oh, that's not too depressing.
Yeah, I mean, cried too many times this past few months from what's been going on. Well, the situation with the Sudanese um, anarchists, it was it's horrifying, but they're still keeping up. A lot of them are in Europe now, and they haven't stopped. So they just increase our self organization and find ways to support because people are gonna keep resisting, and there's a whole whatever tears we shed for them, they're gonna keep things up.
I don't know if either of you folks have read, you probably have, Cedric Robinson. He wrote Black Marxism and Terms of Order. Um, but he had a really cool, he had like two definitions of anarchism that I thought were really, the one I'm thinking of was really good, was that he was saying that, like, frequently when folks, especially in like academia, talk about anarchism, they talk about all this like theory shit, usually rooted in like Western and Eastern Europe, like post Enlightenment. But the reality of it for him was that like anarchism is more of a social phenomena that just appears whenever there's when there's some sort of an oppressive element. When there is some domination that happens, you're just gonna see it come up. Like it's organic. It's just part of human nature to say no, that's not okay. So I think like there's something beautiful about that, right? Is that like I think anarchism is a sort of extension, it's like will to liberation that's just present in all of us, and you're not going to get rid of it. It's just always going to reappear, like all across history, all across epochs, all across the world.
So, I know it's kind of whack for people to ask others when you first meet them, like, hey, what's your job? Because that's a kind of that's a common thing, right? That's a common thing, and I've seen how people should be approaching people in other ways that you should ask them, like, how are you doing? How's your health? Stuff like that. But would I be a jerk if I continue to ask that? If I ask that question specifically to ShotSpotter workers, I mean, shots people in the ShotSpotter campaign, like, what's your job?
Just do it. You should know who you're working with, right? Like that's the thing.
What is Brendan Johnson's favorite color?
How close are you to the mayor?
Oh, God. I mean, if we've gotta trust each other to make this work, you gotta ask. That's just it. Yeah, you don't have to trust everyone. You probably shouldn't.
Yeah, and everybody, you can ask me how I make my money too. I remember I was on the bus one time. This guy was talking to his lady. She was asking him how he made his money. He was like, "Don't ask me how I make my money." And I was like, that's not a good start to a relationship.
Don't ask me how I make my money. I can imagine her face afterwards, just like taken aback. Oh my goodness.
Is it just the mayoral administration that folks are joining, or have you heard of folks joining like other types of government?
I think the main concern is the mayoral administration. I've definitely heard of folks just joining, getting government jobs in general, those that are less closely tied to mayoral administration. But I don't think that ended up being, at least in the time that I was involved, I don't think that was really the primary concern. I'll also say that I think there was a larger, broader discussion, at least at the local in the local campaign, the Chicago local campaign. And there was a decision made by individuals that were a part of it that people should step down if they have a job within the mayoral administration. So that was a sort of decision that ended up getting made. I don't think that necessarily denies having any government job. Like again, like what we said before, I figure if someone's like working with like garbage collection. I don't think anyone in the campaign would really be like, get the fuck out of here. But yeah. But I think we should be asking these questions, like what sort of relationship to government would cause us to have some sort of like security vulnerabilities, or like would make it so that I don't trust the work I'm doing is going to be keeping me safe, for example. These are conversations that we should be having.
If y'all are ever able to publicize like what that agreement looked like, word for word, I think that'd be cool. That'd be cool to share out, so other groups can adopt something similar. I would love to know if any of the ShotSpotter folks are garbage workers. A really fucking fantastic writing that I recently saw. It was shared by a friend of ours in the Anti Domestic Violence Collective. Is Yeah, yeah. So there was this. It came out in 2007. Some folks were talking to like different groups that were doing like anti-violence work, including anti-domestic violence. And in their reflection, they said that like they started off with like this more holistic viewpoint about how to end the violence, but then one big thing that changed things was state funding. And so people started going for different orgs started going for these grants from the government, and you can't criticize the government part of the grants, but also the grants would determine what you would focus on. So then everything became narrow, and instead of being like holistic and being against all forms of violence. Everything just a lot of the discussion, the frameworks, and the activity focused on just helping people out who are experiencing a certain type of violence. And it's Chicago specific. It's one of the best texts I've ever read in my life. And um,
Please share that if you've got a link to it at some point. Yeah.
yeah, and Critical Resistance, thank goodness they're hosting it on their website. It needs to be preserved. We need to like resuscitate it to have this proof about like what happens when you have this alliance with the government, how it distorts, um, how it kills the radical, comprehensive frameworks that you initially started off with. Um,
This is beeping. Do you hear a beeping? Beep, 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 beep. There's like a beeping somewhere. You hear a beeping?
Weird. It might just be my computer. It sucks. It's gonna explode.
or we're picking up a bug. We're picking up a bug.
Oh, like those speakers. They go beep, 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 beep. Incoming call. Incoming call. Oh my god.
Instead of like using the highest tech, they went for something like really old. Feel like you wouldn't
It's like
feel
a,
like
like a Soviet bug or something.
yeah, Soviet they use Soviet technology.
I have to think about like, what if that's how the solutions will come? Is like, okay, if we know everything on this in this how do I say it? If we know everything is being future proofed against people like us, do we have to use older things? Like, do we have to retrofit rotary phones?
Possibly. Could be an idea.
Like, find laser etch floppy disks again? I don't, I don't know. Like,
Yeah. I know what
find
you
new
mean.
ways to jam things? I don't know.
I tend to like think a lot about what drives the companies to do these sorts of to make these kinds of tools, and it's like it just keeps for me. I just keep coming back to like the fact that this market exists, and like if you remove what's necessary for it to exist, like the companies need to be able to get data from the public sector, or they can't make their tools. They need to be able to like police and like federal departments need to be able to sell criminal data, which they can right now. They can, they can sell crime data. There's no regulations, of my understanding, that really prevents crime data from being sold and used in like these products. Like you start severing what feeds their tools, then they're not going to really have much of a market because it'll end up being more expensive to make tools that work than. But right now it's super easy. Relatively speaking, it's easy for them to get this data. It's easy for them to make these tools. It's easy for them to install these things and then get more data and make more tools. If they suddenly lost all access to that, like there's no market for them. There's no money for them to make, and they're gonna move on to some other bullshit.
I think we hit everything that we wanted to hit today. Yeah, and if y'all have any desire to talk again, even if it's just to like, try to spark some ideas to think about the hydras more and give up the source of things. We're always available, whether it's for public or private purposes.
For sure. Yeah, dude, I want to have more of these talks. Because we need to be talking more about this shit. And I feel like I learned a lot just like, you know, chatting about this stuff with y'all.
Well, it was nice talking to everybody.
Yeah, same.
Real quick, I'm gonna post a way for people to donate if they thought this conversation was of value, and if anybody leaves comments as questions or whatever, it could be the basis of another interview to get people's questions answered. Um, yeah, so thanks so much, Harpy, for joining. We did this pretty late, and we fought hard for this interview, but I think we really needed it.
Nice to meet you, and thanks for the info.
Absolutely. Glad to be in solidarity with y'all.